In the 58th year before the Common Era, a man stood at the center of a self-inflicted storm that threatened to erase him from history before his true story could even begin. Julius Caesar was not yet the marble icon of an eternal empire. He was a desperate politician drowning in a sea of debt that would stagger a modern treasury. His creditors were the wolves of Rome, men of old money and sharp influence, and they were closing in. For Caesar, the choice was binary and brutal: total disgrace in the Roman courts followed by a life of obscurity or execution, or a high-stakes gamble in the untamed north. To survive, he would have to lead his untested legions into a wilderness so vast and hostile that no Roman map could contain its borders. This was not a quest for glory or the expansion of civilization. It was a cold-blooded necessity, a war of survival where the prize was not just land, but the power to rewrite the laws of the human race and silence his enemies forever. Rome at this time was a city of gold built upon a foundation of crumbling loyalty and immense financial pressure. The air in the Senate was thin with betrayal, thick with the scent of fresh blood and ancient grudges. Caesar had climbed the political ladder by borrowing sums of money that made him a literal hostage to the city's elite. Every festival he hosted, every bribe he paid, and every public work he sponsored had been funded by the very men who now sought his ruin. In the Roman system, there was only one legal shield against such a debt: a military command that offered enough plunder to pay off the world. The target was Gaul, a land that the Romans viewed with a mixture of profound fear and greedy anticipation. It was a place of mystery, of mist-covered rivers and ancient tribes, where the rigid laws of the city dissolved into the chaos of the frontier. For Caesar, the campaign was a forge where he would either be hammered into a god or broken into nothingness. The crossing of the Alps was more than a physical journey, it was a psychological departure from everything the Roman world understood. As the legions marched northward, the sun seemed to dim beneath a canopy of ancient oaks that had stood since before the founding of the Republic. This was a realm where the Druids were said to commune with the elements and various tribes held a fragile, violent peace that was about to be shattered by the rhythmic thud of Roman boots. Caesar did not come as a mere explorer or a border guard, he arrived as a force of nature, intending to bend this wild landscape to his singular will. He understood a truth his rivals in Rome had forgotten: to conquer a people, you must first disrupt the environment that sustains them. He turned the verdant forests of the north into a theater of calculated dominance, transforming the landscape into an extension of Roman iron and discipline. The initial encounters were not characterized by the grand, open battles found in the history books, but by a chilling sense of displacement and dread. The tribes of Gaul, from the migrating Helvetii to the fierce Belgae, found themselves caught in a geopolitical vice they could not comprehend. Caesar played the role of a protector while simultaneously sowing the seeds of internal discord, pitting brother against brother and tribe against tribe. He offered safety with one hand and demanded total submission with the other. The tension grew as the Roman camps became permanent, jagged fixtures in a land that had never known such rigid, geometric order. Every mile of road built and every bridge constructed was a scar on the face of the ancient world, a physical manifestation of an empire that refused to recognize any boundary it could not engineer its way across. As the campaign stretched into its middle years, between 56 and 54 BC, the conflict shifted from a series of skirmishes into a grim struggle for existence. The forests, once a sanctuary for the tribes, became a claustrophobic trap. Caesar's strategy was not just to defeat his opponents in the field, but to systematically dismantle their ability to live. Supply lines were cut, settlements were isolated, and the very environment was turned against its inhabitants. The Roman war machine was a marvel of engineering, capable of transforming a landscape overnight. They were not just soldiers, they were builders of stone and timber who treated the wilderness as a technical problem to be solved through sheer industrial will. In one instance, to strike fear into the Germanic tribes, Caesar's engineers bridged the Rhine, a river considered impassable by the ancients, in a mere 10 days. This feat of logistics was designed to terrify the local populations into believing the Romans were masters of the elements themselves, capable of commanding the very water they drank. The psychological weight of this campaign was immense on the legions as well. Roman soldiers, far from the sun-drenched hills of Italy, found themselves in a land where the winter never seemed to end and the enemy was often invisible until the moment of contact. They spoke in low voices of strange sightings in the deep woods and the eerie silence that followed the systematic relocation of local populations. Caesar, however, remained a figure of cold, calculating brilliance, moving through the mud and the blood with a terrifying focus. He documented his progress in his personal accounts with a precision that was intended to justify his illegal wars to the skeptics back in Rome. In his prose, he presented himself as the bringer of order, but between the lines, one could sense a bureaucratic brutality. He recorded the dismantling of entire cultures with the same dispassionate tone one might use to tally a grain harvest. To Caesar, history was a ledger, and he was determined to ensure the balance remained in his favor, regardless of the human cost. Resistance eventually found a singular, desperate voice in a young Arverni chieftain named Vercingetorix. By 52 BC, the tribes had realized that their internal bickering was the oxygen that Caesar's ambition breathed. Vercingetorix was the first to realize that the tribes could not win by fighting like Romans, they had to fight like the land itself. He utilized a scorched earth policy, burning his own villages, his own storehouses, and his own fields to deny the legions the resources they needed to survive. This turned the conflict into a test of absolute endurance that nearly broke the Roman machine. The northern frontier became a landscape of ash and hunger as the Romans found themselves starving in a land they supposedly controlled. The atmosphere was one of paranoia and desperation, with both sides pushed to the absolute limits of human capability. For the first time, Caesar's gamble looked like it might end in a shallow grave in the mud of a forgotten forest. The climax of this era arrived in the late summer of 52 BC at the hilltop fortress of Alesia. It was here that the two worlds collided in a display of tactical ingenuity and raw human struggle that defies military logic. Caesar, facing a massive Gallic relief army while simultaneously besieging Vercingetorix inside the city, did something unprecedented. He built a wall around the city to keep the defenders in, known as circumvallation, and then built a second, outward-facing wall around his own army, known as contravallation, to keep the massive relief forces out. It was a masterpiece of containment, a literal circle of iron that squeezed the life out of the Gallic resistance. For weeks, the silence around the fortifications was broken only by the sounds of Roman construction and the desperate, starving cries from the ramparts of the city. The world outside the fortifications had ceased to exist, there was only the circle, the hunger, and the weight. The battle for Alesia was a descent into a mechanical hell. Inside the city, the air grew thick with the stench of disease and the slow rot of hope. Vercingetorix looked out over the double walls, realizing he was trapped in a cage of his own enemies' making. Outside, the Roman soldiers fought with their backs to their own walls, trapped between two enemies, surviving on grit and the terrifying certainty that defeat meant total annihilation. The clashes were frantic and claustrophobic. Men fought in the trenches, the mud turning slick with blood as the Gallic relief forces threw themselves against the Roman outer works in waves of suicidal bravery. But the Roman lines held, anchored by a desperate, animalistic will to live. When the relief army finally broke and vanished into the woods, the spirit of Gaul broke with them. The surrender of Vercingetorix, who famously rode out of the gates and laid his armor at Caesar's feet, marked the end of an era that had lasted for centuries. The forests were no longer a place of myth and legend, they were now a province, a resource to be harvested for the glory of a city hundreds of miles away. Caesar had achieved his goal. He had acquired the wealth he needed to pay his debts and the reputation he needed to seize absolute power. But the land he left behind was a ghost of its former self, its social structures dissolved and its ancient traditions buried under the weight of Roman administration. The numbers recorded by historical sources are staggering and the reality was dark. It is estimated that during the 8 years of the Gallic Wars, an immense number of people were killed and many more were sold into the slave markets of the Mediterranean. Caesar had not just conquered a territory, he had overseen a systematic erasure of a culture to fund his own political ascent. The return to Rome in 49 BC was a triumph, but the man who entered the gates was not the same politician who had left years prior. He had seen the depths of what was required to build an empire and the price of total victory. He had learned that power is not just about laws and speeches, but about the ability to redefine reality through force and persistence. As he approached the Rubicon, the small river that marked the boundary of his command, he carried with him more than just his battle-hardened legions. Crossing the Rubicon was a mere formality, the real transition had occurred in the mud of Alesia and the blood of the Rhine. When Caesar stepped onto Italian soil, he brought the methodology of the Gallic Wars with him. The tactics he had used to tame the wild north, the psychological warfare, the systematic dismantling of opposition, the relentless engineering of outcomes, were now turned toward the heart of the Roman state. The senators who had once feared his debts now feared his silence. They realized that the man who had broken the spirit of a continent would find the halls of the Senate easy to navigate. The air in Rome grew heavy, mirroring the oppressive atmosphere of the northern thickets before a storm. The Republic was in its final hours, it just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The transition from a representative government to a centralized autocracy was not a sudden event, but a slow suffocation led by a man who no longer believed in the old rules. The legacy of this period is one of profound and unsettling complexity. On one hand, the integration of Gaul into the Roman world paved the way for the development of modern Europe, bringing roads, cities, and a unified legal system that would persist for a millennium. On the other hand, the cost was the erasure of a rich tapestry of cultures and the transformation of a continent into a mirror of Roman ambition. The wilderness was eventually cleared, the swamps drained, and the mysteries of the old world lost to time, replaced by the orderly rows of Roman villas and the relentless march of progress. Caesar's journey from a bankrupt politician to the master of the known world is a narrative of risk and conflict that remains a cornerstone of historical study, a reminder of how quickly the world can change when one man decides he has nothing left to lose. Looking back through the lens of history, the rise of Caesar serves as a cautionary tale about the nature of unchecked ambition. It shows how the pursuit of personal security and status can lead to the fundamental reshaping of the world, often in ways that the protagonists themselves might not have fully anticipated. The conflict in Gaul was the forge in which the Roman Empire was truly tempered, turning a fragile republic into a rigid autocracy. The echoes of the axes in the woods and the clatter of shields in the mist can still be felt if one listens closely to the stories we tell about the foundations of our civilization. It was a transformation bought with the currency of human lives and the identity of a culture that would never truly recover its independence. As we examine the maps of today, it is easy to forget that the borders were once written in the sweat and resolve of those who navigated the thickets of the past. The transformation of Gaul was a process of turning what was perceived as chaos into a rigid order, but in doing so, something essential was lost. The wildness that once defined the heart of the continent was replaced by a structure that prioritized efficiency over mystery. The silence that now sits over the ancient battlefields of Alesia and the Rhine is a testament to the permanence of change and the weight of progress. The rivers still flow and the hills still stand, but the spirit of the place was irrevocably altered during those years of campaign. The story of the Gallic campaign is not just about a man or a war, it is about the moment when the ancient world met the modern machinery of empire, and the machinery won. It reminds us that every empire is built on a foundation of difficult choices and that the price of absolute power is often paid by those who never asked for the conflict in the first place. Caesar did not just conquer a territory, he conquered a concept. He proved that even the most formidable wilderness could be tamed if one was willing to be more ruthless than the environment itself. He turned the untamed north into a Roman garden, but the cost of the maintenance would be eternal vigilance and a permanent shift in the human story toward the dominance of the state over the individual. The journey through the north was a descent into the heart of human nature, revealing the lengths to which a person will go to escape their own shadow. For Caesar, Gaul was the forge, For the tribes, it was the end of their world. As the legions finally turned their backs on the northern forests and marched toward the heart of the Republic, they carried with them the heavy weight of what they had done. They were no longer just soldiers, they were the architects of a new world order, one that would stand for centuries on the ground they had so violently claimed. They were the harbingers of a peace that felt like a permanent occupation, a Pax Romana bought with an unfathomable human cost. History has a way of smoothing over the rough edges of the past, turning terrifying ordeals into neat paragraphs in a textbook. But the reality of the Gallic campaign was a visceral, dark thriller that played out in the mud and the mist. It was a story of survival, betrayal, and the terrifying efficiency of a mind focused on a single, personal goal. Even now, the name of Caesar evokes a sense of awe and unease, a reminder of what happens when a man decides that the world is not enough, and that even the foundations of society must make way for his march. His ambition was a fire that consumed everything it touched to keep him warm in the cold vacuum of Roman politics. As we conclude this exploration of Caesar's rise, we are left with a haunting image of a man standing on a hill in 49 BC, looking out over a land that he has broken and remade. The risks he took were calculated, the conflicts were inevitable, and the outcome was a total transformation of the human story. The wilderness had been mastered, but the tension had simply moved from the forest into the heart of the empire itself. The price of peace was permanent vigilance, and the price of power was a debt that could never truly be repaid, no matter how much gold was looted from the temples of the north. The debt of his youth had been settled, but a much larger debt to history had just begun. The legacy of the Gallic era remains a cornerstone of our collective memory, a mirror reflecting the ambitions and fears that drive the human race. It serves as a reminder that the path to greatness is often paved with the remnants of the worlds we leave behind. Whether we view Caesar as a hero of civilization or a harbinger of destruction, we cannot deny the magnitude of his impact. The silence of the ancient woods has been replaced by the noise of the modern world, but the ghosts of the old tribes still linger in the margins of history, watching as the cycle of empire continues to turn, driven by the same hunger for security and power that drove a bankrupt politician into the heart of the north. In the end, the story of Caesar in Gaul is a testament to the power of a single will to bend the world to its shape. It is a reminder that the line between a savior and a conqueror is often thin, drawn in the soil of a foreign land and washed away by the tides of time. The Roman sun eventually set, and the forests grew back over the ruins of the villas, but the memory of the man who stood on the edge of the precipice and chose to jump remains etched into the very fabric of our history. We live in the world he built, a world of roads and laws, but we still feel the chill of the forest he destroyed, a shadow that follows us even in the brightest light of the modern age.